Section 10 of Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 6 by Charles F. Horne. James Watt. James Watt was born at Greenwich, January 19, 1736. He was the fourth child in a family which for 100 years had more or less professed mathematics and navigation. His constitution was delicate and his mental powers were precocious. He was distinguished from an early age by his candor and truthfulness, and his father, to ascertain the cause of any of his boys' quarrels, used to say, "Let James speak. From him I always hear the truth." James also showed his constructive taste equally early, experimenting on his playthings with a set of small carpenter's tools which his father had given him. At 6 he was still at home. "Mr. Watt," said a friend to the father, "you ought to send that boy to school and not let him trifle away his time at home." "Look what he is doing before you condemn him," was the reply. The visitor then observed the child had drawn mathematical lines and figures on the hearth and was engaged in a process of calculation. On putting questions to him, he was astonished at his quickness and simplicity. "Forgive me," said he, "this child's education has not been neglected. This is no common child." Watt's cousin, Mrs. Marion Campbell, describes his inventive capacity as a storyteller and details an incident of his occupying himself with the steam of a tea kettle, and by means of a cup and a spoon making an early experiment in the condensation of steam. To this incident she probably attached more importance than was its due from reverting to it when illustrated by her after recollections. Out of this story, reliable or not in the sense ascribed to it, M. Arago obtained an oratorical point for an éloge, which he delivered to the French Institute. Watt may or may not have been occupied as a boy with the study of condensation of steam while he was playing with the kettle. The story suggests a possibility, nothing more, though it has been made the foundation of a grave announcement, the subject of a pretty picture, and will ever remain a basis for suggestive speculation. Watt was sent to a commercial school where he was provided with a fair outfit of Latin and with some elements of Greek, but mathematics he studied with greater zest and with proportionate success. By the time he was 15, he had read twice with grave attention Graveson's Elements of Natural Philosophy, and while under his father's roof he went on with various chemical experiments, repeating them again and again, until satisfied of their accuracy from his own observations. He even made himself a small electrical machine about 1750 to 53, no mean performance at that date, since, according to Priestley's History of Electricity, the Leyden file itself was not invented until the years 1745 to 46. His pastime lay chiefly in his father's marine store, among the sails and ropes, the blocks and tackle, or by the old gray gateway of the mansion house on the hill above Greenwich, where he would loiter away hours by day, and at night lie down on his back and watch the stars through the trees. At this early age, Watt suffered from continual and violent headaches, which often affected his nervous system for many days, even weeks, and he was similarly afflicted throughout his long life. He seldom rose early, but accomplished more in a few hours' study than ordinary minds do in many days. He was never in a hurry, and always had leisure to give to his friends, to poetry, romance, and the publications of the day. He read indiscriminately almost every new book he could procure. He assisted his father in his business, and soon learned to construct with his own hands several of the articles required in the way of his parents' trade, and by means of a small forge set up for his own use, he repaired and made various kinds of instruments, and converted, by the way, a large silver coin into a punch ladle as a trophy of his early skill as a metalsmith. From this aptitude for ingenious handiwork, and in accordance with his own deliberate choice, it was decided that he should proceed to qualify himself for following the trade of a mathematical instrument maker. He accordingly went to Glasgow in June, 1754, and from there, after a year's stay, he proceeded for better instruction to London. On Watt's arrival in the metropolis, he sought his situation, but in vain, and he was beginning to despond when he obtained work with one John Morgan, an instrument maker in Finch Lane, Cornhill. Here he gradually became proficient in making quadrants, parallel rulers, compasses, theodolites, etc., until at the end of a year's practice he could make a brass sector with a French joint, which is reckoned as nice a piece of framing work as is in the trade. During this interval he contrived to live upon 8 shillings a week, exclusive of his lodging. His fear of the press gang and his bodily ailments, however, led to his quitting London in August 1756 and returning to Scotland, after investing 20 guineas in additional tools. At Glasgow, through the intervention of Dr. Dick, he was first employed in cleaning and repairing some of the instruments belonging to the college, and after some difficulty he received permission to open a shop within the precincts as mathematical instrument maker to the university. Here Watt prospered, pursuing alike his course of manual labor and of mental study, and especially extending his acquaintance with physics, endeavoring, as he said, to find out the weak side of nature and to vanquish her. About this time he contrived an ingenious machine for drawing in perspective, and from 50 to 80 of these instruments manufactured by him were sent to different parts of the world. He had now procured the friendship of Dr. Black and another university worthy, John Robison, who, in stating the circumstances of his first introduction to Watt, says, "I saw a workman and expected no more, but was surprised to find a philosopher as young as myself and always ready to instruct me." It was sometime in 1764 that the professor of natural philosophy in the university desired Watt to repair a pretty model of Newcomen's steam engine. Like everything which came into Watt's hands, it soon became an object of most serious study. The interesting little model, as altered by the hand of Watt, was long placed beside the noble statue of the engineer in the Ontarian Museum at Glasgow. Watt himself, when he had got the bearings of his invention, could think of nothing else but his machine, and addressed himself to Dr. Roebuck, of the Carron Iron Works. With a view of his practical introduction to the world, a partnership ensued, but the connection did not prove satisfactory. Watt went on with his experiments, and in September 1766 wrote to a friend, "I think I have laid upon a stock of experience that will soon pay me for the trouble it has cost me." Yet it was between 8 and 9 years before that invaluable experience was made available, so as either to benefit the public or repay the inventor, and a much longer term elapsed before it was possible for that repayment to be reckoned in the form of substantial profit. Watt now began to practice as a land surveyor and civil engineer. His first engineering work was a survey for a canal to unite the Forth and Clyde, in furtherance of which he had to appear before the House of Commons. His consequent journey to London was still more important, for then it was that he saw for the first time the great manufactory which Bolton had established at Soho, and of which he was afterward himself to be the guiding intelligence. In the meantime, among his other performances, he invented a micrometer for measuring distances, and, what is still more remarkable, he entertained the idea of moving canal boats by the steam engine through the instrumentality of a spiral oar, which as nearly as possible coincides with the screw propeller of our day. Watt's negotiations for a partnership with Bolton were long and tedious. Dr. Roebuck's creditors concurred because, curiously enough, none of them valued Watt's engine at a farthing. Watt himself now began to despair, and his health failed. Yet in 1774, when he had removed to Birmingham, he wrote to his father, "The fire engine I have invented is now going, and answers much better than any other that has yet been made, and I expect that invention will be very beneficial to me." A long series of experimental trials was, nevertheless, requisite before the engine could be brought to such perfection as to render it generally available to the public, and therefore profitable to its manufacturers. In January 1775, 6 years of the patent had elapsed, and there seemed some probability of the remaining 8 running out as fruitlessly. An application which was made for the extension of his term was unexpectedly opposed by the eloquence of Burke. But the orator and his associates failed, and the extension was accorded by Act of Parliament. The first practical employment of Watt's engines to any considerable extent was in the mining districts of Cornwall, where he himself was, in consequence, compelled to spend much of his time subsequent to 1775. Here he had to contend not only with natural obstacles in the dark abyss of deeply flooded mines, but with a rude and obstinate class of men as deeply flooded by inveterate prejudices. The result in the way of profit was not, however, satisfactory, notwithstanding the service to the mining interest was enormous. It appears, says Watt in 1780, by our books that Cornwall has hitherto eat up all the profits we have drawn from it, and all we have got by other places, and a good sum of our own money to the bargain. At this stage Watt himself was more fertile in mechanical inventions than in any other portion of his busy life. Taking his patents in their chronological order, the first, subject to that of 1769, was for a new method of copying letters and other writings expeditiously by means of copying presses. Of the same date was his invention of a machine for drying linen and muslin by steam. On October 25, 1781, he took out his third patent, the second of the steam engine series, for certain new methods of applying the vibrating or reciprocating motion of steam or fire engines to produce a continued rotative motion round an axis or center, and thereby to give motion to the wheels of mills or other machines. One of these methods was that commonly known as the sun and planet wheels. There were 5 in all. A favorite employment of his in the workshops at Soho in the later months of 1783 and earlier ones of 1784 was to teach his steam engine, now become nearly as docile as it was powerful, to work the tilt hammer for forging iron and making steel. 300 blows per minute, a thing never done before, filled him, as his biographer says, with feelings of excusable pride. Another patent in the steam engine series, taken out in 1784, contained, besides other methods of converting a circular or angular motion into perpendicular or rectilineal motion, the well-known and much admired parallel motion, and the application of the steam engine to give motion to wheel carriages for carrying persons and goods. To ascertain the number of strokes made by an engine during a given time, and thereby to check the cheats of the Cornish miners, Watt also invented the counter, with its several indexes. Among his leading improvements introduced at various periods were the throttle valve, the application of the governor, the barometer or float, the steam gauge, and the indicator. The term during which he seems to have thus combined the greatest maturity with the greatest activity of intellect, and the portion of his life which they comprehended, was from his 40th to his 50th year. Yet it was a term of increased suffering from his acute sick headaches, and remarkable for the infirmities over which he triumphed. Notwithstanding, he himself complained of his stupidity and want of the inventive faculty. Watt's chemical studies in 1783 and the calculations they involved from experiments made by foreign chemists induced him to make a proposal for a philosophical uniformity of weights and measures, and he discussed this proposal with Priestley and Magellan. While Watt was examining the constituent parts of water, he had opportunities of familiar intercourse not only with Priestley, but with Withering, Keir, Edgeworth, Galton, Darwin, and his own partner, Bolton, all men above the average for their common interest in scientific inquiries. Dr. Parr frequently attended their meetings, and they kept up a correspondence with Sir William Herschel, Sir Joseph Banks, Dr. Solander, and Vecilius. Mrs. Schimmelpenninck, who was greatly given to physiognomical studies, has left us this picture of Watt at this period. Mr. Bolton was a man to rule society with dignity. Mr. Watt to lead the contemplative life of a deeply introverted and patiently observant philosopher. He was one of the most complete specimens of the melancholic temperament. His head was generally bent forward or leaning on his hand in meditation, his shoulders stooping, and his chest falling in, his limbs lank and unmuscular, and his complexion sallow. His intellectual development was magnificent. Comparison and casualty immense, with large ideality and constructiveness, individuality, and enormous concentratedness and caution. He had a broad Scottish accent, gentle, modest, and unassuming manners. Yet when he entered a room, men of letters, men of science, nay, military men, artists, ladies, even little children thronged around him. Ladies would appeal to him on the best means of devising grates, curing smoky chimneys, warming their houses, and obtaining fast colors. I can speak from experience of his teaching me how to make a dulcimer and improve a Jew's harp. In the year 1786, Watt and Boulton visited Paris on the invitation of the French government to superintend the erection of certain steam engines and especially to suggest improvements in the great hydraulic machine of Marly, which Watt himself designates a venerable work. In Paris, Watt made many acquaintances, including Lavoisier, Laplace, Fourcroy, and others scarcely less eminent. And while here he discussed with Berthollet a new method of bleaching by chlorides, an invention of the latter which Watt subsequently introduced into England. Meanwhile, Watt had vigilantly to defend his patents at home, which were assailed by unworthy and surreptitious rivals as soon as it was proved they were pecuniarily valuable. Some of the competing engines, as Watt himself described them, were simply asthmatic. Hornblowers at Radstock was obliged to stand still once every 10 minutes to snore and snort. Some were like Evans' mill, which was a gentlemanly mill. It would go when it had nothing to do, but it refused to work. The legal proceedings, both in equity and at common law, which now became necessary, were numerous. One bill of costs from 1796 to 1800 amounted to between £5,000 and £6,000, and the mental and bodily labor, the anxiety and vexation which were superadded, involved a fearful tax on the province of Watt's discoveries. With the year 1800 came the expiration of the privilege of patent of 1769, as extended by the statute of 1775, and also the dissolution of the original co-partnership of Messrs. Boulton and Watt, then of 25 years' duration. The contract was renewed by their sons, the business having become so profitable that Watt and his children were provided with a source of independent income, and at the age of 64, the great inventor had personally realized some of the benefits he contemplated. Henceforth, Watt's ingenuity became excursive, discretionary, almost capricious, but in every phase and form it continued to be beneficent. In 1808 he founded a prize in Glasgow College as an acknowledgment of the many favors that learned body had conferred upon him. In 1816 he made a donation to the town of Greenock to form the beginning of a scientific library for the instruction of its young men. Nor amid such donations were others wanting on his part, such as true religion prescribes to console the poor and relieve the suffering. In 1816, on a visit to Greenock, Watt made a voyage in a steamboat to Rothsay and back again. In the course of this experimental trip, he pointed out to the engineer of the boat the method of backing the engine. With a foot rule he demonstrated to him what he meant. Not succeeding, however, he at last, under the impulse of the ruling passion, and we must remember he was then 80, threw off his overcoat, and putting his hand to the engine himself, showed the practical application of his lecture. Previously to this, the backstroke of the steamboat engine was either unknown or not generally known. The practice was to stop the engine entirely a considerable time before the vessel reached the point of mooring in order to allow for the gradual and natural diminution of her speed. With regard to the application of steam power to locomotion on land, it is remarkable enough that when Watt's attention was first directed by his friend Robeson to the steam engine, he, Robeson, at the time, drew out the idea of applying the power to the moving of wheel carriages, but the scheme, adds Watt, was not matured, and was soon abandoned on his going abroad. In 1769, however, when he heard that a linen draper, one Moore, had taken out a patent for moving wheel carriages by steam, he replied, "If linen draper Moore does not use my engine to drive his chaises, he can't drive them by steam." In the specification of his patent of 1784, he even described the principles and construction of steam engines which are applied to give motion to wheel carriages for removing persons or goods or other matters from place to place. and in 1786 Watt himself had a steam carriage of some size underhand, but his most developed plan was to move such carriages on a hard, smooth plain, and there is no evidence to show that he ever anticipated the union of the rail and wheel. Among Watt's mechanical recreations, soon after the date of the last of his steam engine patents, were 4 plans of making lamps, which he describes in a letter to Argonne, and for a long time lamps were made at Soho upon his principles, which gave a light surpassing, both in steadiness and brilliancy, anything of the kind that had appeared. About a year after, in 1788, he made a pretty instrument for determining the specific gravities of liquids, having, he said to Dr. Black, improved on the hint he had taken. Watt also turned his idle thoughts toward the construction of an arithmetical machine, but he does not appear ever to have prosecuted this design further than by mentally considering the manner in which he could make it perform the processes of multiplication and division. Early in the present century, Watt devised for the Glasgow waterworks to bring pure spring water across the Clyde an articulated suction pipe, with joints formed on the principle of those in a lobster's tail, and so made capable of accommodating itself to all the actual and possible bendings at the bottom of the river. This pipe was moreover executed at Soho from his plans, and was found to succeed perfectly. Watt describes as his hobby a machine to copy sculpture, suggested to him by an implement he had seen and admired in Paris in 1802, where it was used for tracing and multiplying the dyes of metals. He foresaw the possibility of enlarging his powers so as to make it capable of working even on wood and marble. To do for solid masses and in hard materials what his copying machine of 1782 had already done for drawings and writings impressed upon flat surfaces of paper, to produce, in fact, a perfect facsimile of the original model. He worked at this machine most assiduously, and his likeness lays, as he termed it, was set up in a garret, which, with all its mysterious contents, its tools and models included, have been carefully preserved as he left them. It is gratifying to find the charm of Watt's presence was not dimmed by age. His friends, said Lord Jeffrey, speaking of a visit which he paid to Scotland when upward of 80, in that part of the century never saw him more full of intellectual vigor and colloquial animation, never more delightful or more instructive. It was then also that Sir Walter Scott, meeting him, surrounded by a little band of northern literati, saw and heard what he felt he was never to see or hear again. The alert, kind, benevolent old man, his talents and fancy overflowing on every subject, with his attention alive to everyone's question, his information at everyone's command. Campbell, the poet who saw him later in the beginning of 1819, he was then 83, describes him as so full of anecdote that he spent one of the most amusing days he had ever had with him. Lord Brougham, later still in the summer of the same year, found his instructive conversation and his lively and even playful manner unchanged. But in the autumn of this year, on August 19th, he expired tranquilly at his house at Heathfield. He was buried at Handsworth. A tribute to his memory was but tardily rendered by the nation. Jeffrey and Arago added more elaborate tributes to Watt's genius, and Wordsworth has declared that he looked upon him, considering his magnitude and universality, as perhaps the most extraordinary man this country has ever produced. His noblest monument is, however, his own work. End of section 10.